Today we're working with CSS selectors, and there are three levels of selectors that are the most common. Now, I've got Visual Studio Code open here on the left, and I have a blank style.css file that is linked to our HTML file. And the HTML file is open in Chrome already. I'm using the live server extension with Visual Studio Code, so we will instantly see our changes in our page. The structure of the HTML page has an H1 heading, and after that we have three articles. Each article has its own H2 heading and paragraph inside. So as we talk about the three different types of basic selectors in CSS, let's start with the most common, which is an element selector. And I'm going to select the body element. Now there is only one body element per page, but we have some very small font, and I will get into more properties for each of the declarations as we go through tutorials, but I'm going to use a few today just for examples. And I'm going to set the font size to 22 pixels and save. Now we can see this made all of our text on our page larger, and this is due to inheritance. So these other elements actually inherited from the body element, and we'll get more into inheritance in just a little bit too. But this in itself is an element selector. Now, there's only one body element per page, but say I went ahead and selected the paragraph using the paragraph selector, and now I can set the color of the text, and I'm going to set the color of the text to purple, and I'll save. And notice it changed all three of our paragraphs to purple. So element selectors select all of the elements of that type. So just specifying P for the paragraph element selects all paragraph elements. And now the second type of selector is a class. And so let's define a class selector, and I'm going to call this class gray. Note that a class starts with a period before whatever you name the class, and you can choose the name of the class, but make sure it makes sense, and remember you're writing code for others to read, not just yourself. Okay, inside of this, I'm going to set the color to gray. That makes sense to me. Now I'll save that, and notice paragraphs 2 and 3 turn the gray color. And if we look at our HTML, which is a little crowded over here, but if I scroll down to the second paragraph here, we have a class set equal to gray on that paragraph. Likewise, we have a class set equal to gray on the third paragraph as well. So classes can be used more than once, and they're very useful that way. You're creating styles that you can apply throughout your project or throughout your page, and then they can be reused with more than one element. And note, classes are more specific than selecting all paragraphs, for example, and because they're more specific, they overruled the purple setting that we had for all paragraphs, and now gray applied to these last two paragraphs here. And we will also discuss specificity in more detail in just a few minutes as well. Now, classes are the most common type of selector with CSS, but the more specific selector yet is an ID selector, and I have an ID named second, an ID attribute inside of the HTML, and here I'm going to apply a font style, and we'll set that to italic, and I like to have a space afterwards. Now I'll save, and notice the second paragraph became italic as well. So it specifically addressed the second paragraph. Now, IDs should only exist once in an HTML document. They should be unique, in other words. However, it is not good practice to really use IDs inside of your CSS. Now, it will validate your code has no problem using an ID. However, typically you should use classes and sometimes element selectors, but rarely, if ever, should you use an ID selector inside of your CSS. They do have other valid uses. If you remember from HTML, linking a form input back to a label element, and then as you learn JavaScript, you may have some other uses for ID attributes as well, but we try to keep them out of CSS. And now that we've covered the three basic types of selectors, let's discuss what you can do with some of them just a little bit more. So let's have our H1 here, and let's set the color for the H1 to blue. And we'll save, and we can see it only selected the H1. We only have one H1 on our page. But we can also group selectors. So let's set all of the H2s as well to blue. And you can see I just put a comma between, and then this declaration, or this rule set, the entire rule set, if we had more rules in here, more declarations I should say, would apply to both the H1 and the H2. So you can go ahead and group selectors with a comma in between. Now notice what happens if I remove the comma and save. This declaration, our full rule set, especially if we had more declarations, none of it would apply to the H1 or the H2. Now what's going on here? This selector is looking for any H2s that exist inside of an H1. It's not looking for an H1 or an H2. It's only looking for H2s that exist or are nested, if you will, inside of an H1. So that's why that didn't work. That may be useful to know in the future, but what we need is a comma in between, and then we can select both the H1 and all H2s on the page with this rule set. So let's look at an example of where we would select an element that's inside another element. So let's start with our paragraph elements again, and now we'll look for any span element inside any paragraph element. And here let's set a couple of values. So we'll set text-transform, and I'm going to choose uppercase here. And then I'm also going to set a background color, and let's set this to gold so it stands out. We're essentially highlighting what we want to see. And now we can see we have set this word, whatever this word is, this is Latin from our lorem ipsum, we've set it to uppercase, and same with ipsum. And then we also set gold behind each of these words with this. However, this doesn't make a lot of sense. This is a much better example of where we should use a class. We might name our class something like highlight, and then apply that to our span elements inside of the index. So we've come in here and find our span, and I'll select both of these. And then we can add the class highlight, and that makes it reusable if I spell highlight correctly. There we go, and save. And now it's once again applied, but this would keep our CSS much more organized and actually more reusable. It's more flexible this way because we might have some span elements doing other things that we didn't want to apply this rule set to. And now one last selector to discuss. It exists. We wouldn't use it that often, but it is the universal selector. And this means it's selecting everything on the page. You typically only see this for what is called a CSS reset that we will cover in the future. But just so you know it exists, this selects everything. So let's think about what we could apply here that would be applicable to everything. So let's change the font, and we'll set it to this monospace font and save. And now you can see all of the text on the page turned into this monospace font instead of the default font that we had. Now this is not how we would use this. Again, in the future, we'll learn about a CSS reset that would use that selector, but typically that's the only time you see that universal selector used. Okay, let's discuss the cascade. CSS is an acronym for cascading style sheets, and essentially that means CSS works like a waterfall. It works from the top down, and that means if I were to put in another definition, I'll just copy this down for paragraph, and where we have the color purple on our first paragraph, it really applies to all, but then of course the gray class overrides that on the final two. But if I came here and said red instead of purple, notice how this paragraph turns red, and that's because it read this rule set last. So first CSS looked at this at the top. It starts at the top and it works its way down, and so it read this last. Essentially this is the last rule, and that means whichever definition it reads at the last will be applied. Now, specificity can override this, and that's where we talked about elements and then classes. Classes are more specific, for example, than just an element selector. So we have our class here that has the color gray, and it is overriding the red. Now, if we remove this class and we save, now they're all red. But even though we're looking at the cascade and starting from the top down, even if I put this class above the paragraph selectors and save, it still applies to these last two paragraphs because it has more specificity than an element selector. And the element selector here, purple, of course, is overridden with the last rule being the element selector here for red. So we start out with a red paragraph, and it's really applied to all paragraphs except that then CSS sees there is a gray class applied to the second and third paragraphs, and that has more specificity, so it overrules whatever is set by the element selector. Now, a problem you can have is when you have a large CSS file and maybe you have set this gray class on these paragraphs, and later on, let's say you're way down a couple of hundred lines and you're setting a color on a paragraph and you can't understand why it's not being applied. So let's go ahead and expand Chrome here, and you can right click and choose Inspect. And once you inspect your page, then you can look at the different classes and CSS rules that are applied. So here's a good example of that. We have got our third paragraph highlighted up here in the Elements tab, and then we're looking at the styles, and we can see we've got paragraph rules here, these element selectors, but color purple is crossed out, and then color red is crossed out. So CSS knows these rule sets exist for paragraph, but it also knows it should follow what is the most specific using the rules of specificity. So here we have a color gray that is being applied. So you can see sometimes when you're struggling with your CSS and you have written a rule and you're not understanding why it is not being applied, you should inspect your code with DevTools. And once again, you right click and choose Inspect to do that, and then just go to the correct tabs, Elements, highlight the element that you want, look at the styles, and you'll see how it is being read by CSS in the browser, or how the browser is reading your CSS, and then see how those rule sets are being applied, which ones are being overridden and which ones are actually being applied. Okay, I'm going to close that out now, and I'll resize Chrome. So I'll come back over here to our style, and as we go to the top, let's talk about inheritance, as I got into specificity a little bit already. But inheritance, that is where another element inherits the settings from, or the properties from, its parent element. So the body element is parent to every other element here. And so when we set the font size, all of these other elements inherited that font size. Now, typically anything related to font or typography is inherited, and that can include things like color, line height, alignment, all sorts of settings dealing with the font and the typography. However, any properties that are not related to those things are not inherited. And I know that'll just take a little bit of getting used to as you learn more about CSS. So for example, this font size was inherited, but another setting we could put is a border, and I'll put 3 pixels so it's easy to see, solid black. And I'll save this. Now notice the border only went around the body element. It didn't apply to all the other elements inside of the body. So that's an example of something that is not inherited. Now I'll go ahead and remove that again. Now we did briefly talk about that universal selector. Let me go back to that and show you that this is not inheritance. This is actually selecting all elements. So here, if I said a border, and I'll put 1 pixel solid red and save, notice it does apply to all elements. That's because we selected all the elements here. So setting something here with the universal selector is not going to cause inheritance really, because it's actually selecting all the elements itself. Okay, I'll remove the universal selector again, but getting back to just the inheritance overall, this can be very handy because it keeps us from writing repeated code. In other words, it keeps our code dry, which is an acronym that stands for don't repeat yourself. So we want to write less code and be more efficient, and inheritance helps us do that. Now, some things are not inherited. Like I mentioned, the border would be one of those. Also, form elements do not inherit, say, the font size and other typography settings. So it wouldn't be that unusual to see something like this that would take a button and, let's say, an input, a text area, and let me see if I'm leaving anything else out, maybe a select, anything like that, and we might see then font and set it to inherit. And that would go ahead and make those elements inherit the font settings, because just a mental note that form elements do not typically inherit those font settings. But now, to take advantage of inheritance and write dry code, we can use the body element, which appears only once per page, or we could use the HTML element, and either would work. Oftentimes, if you're just starting out and just remembering, it might be best to just use the body. Oftentimes, I use the HTML element because, once again, the inheritance applies there. So we can save here without, see the difference. Now I'll go ahead and apply it in HTML. And once again, we have the larger font, because there are, for me at least, some specific settings for the body, and I like to see those separate. So I often put all of my font settings in the HTML selector, but again, either would work. One other element selector that I do use at times is the main element. It is a semantic element, and it should appear only once per page, but then you have to be aware that you're only selecting the things inside of the main element. So if we look at our page, I've got the H1 inside of a header element and not inside of the main element. So if I were to change the font family inside of our main selector and I change this to monospace, which is easy to see the change with, go ahead and save, you can see all of the articles switch to monospace, but our H1 heading is still using the other font. Okay, coming back to specificity, just something we talked about, so a quick review. Their element selector is the least specific, and then a class selector is more specific, and then, although we don't want to use them in our CSS, an ID selector is even more specific than that. Sometimes something's not working out and you're wanting to figure out why it's not working out, or you just can't figure it out and you get frustrated. I'm going to show you something that will work, but I'm going to recommend that you do not use it. It's kind of the nuclear option, if you will, and it's to put an exclamation mark and put important. Now see how red should be applied to this first paragraph. But with the important flag right here after our purple setting, and now I save, notice what happened. It turned the first paragraph purple. Notice what else happened. It also turned the second paragraph and the third paragraph purple. Now, why is that? Well, this important essentially ruins everything else. It overrides everything. So really, when you see it in code, it's kind of an indication that it's not well organized or it's sloppy. There's only a few reasons you would really want to use this. And I feel like, I'm hesitant to even show it because I feel like beginners could abuse this. However, you'll see it somewhere. I just want you to know it exists. Don't use it. Don't use it. You need to learn how to organize your code and apply it correctly. And only after you've learned CSS well enough to understand when to use that important flag, that's the only time you should use it. You should really not give up the struggle. You will learn more by struggling and learning how to apply these selectors in the proper way without using that important flag. I do want to show you one thing that will help you learn, and that is the specificity calculator. And I will give a link to this in the resources. You can see they've got some basic values here that are already fairly complicated, but you can zero these out and you can compare two selectors to see why they are working and why they aren't working, or why one overrules the other. You can see an element selector here for an H2 has a score of 001. But if I put in my class of gray, it has a score of 010, in other words 10, which is a higher score than 1. So the class overrules the element selector. And likewise, if we put in an ID selector, like we had second, it has a score of 100 over 10, so that is better. Now you could apply more than one class, for example, to an element. So let's see what happens if we had a second class and we had our highlight class. Now this has a score of 20, but it's still not going to be as high as a score of 100. So this specificity calculator will certainly help you understand why one rule is being applied, or why one selector, I should say, is being applied over another.